Hi, and welcome again, or perhaps for the first time, to the Theology Mill podcast, which is brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Michael. I work here at Whitfinstock, and I'm the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. On this episode, I talk with Dr. Laurie M. Johnson. So Laurie is professor of political science at Kansas State University and the president of the Morin Academy, which you can find the link to in the show notes. Most of her work has involved sort of developing an understanding and a critique of classical liberal theory, and so that includes works on Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Tocqueville, folks like that. Her recent 2019 book, entitled Ideological Possession and the Rise of the New Right, sort of sets the stage for her newest book, which we talk about in some depth in this episode, which is called The Gap in God's Country, A Longer View on Our Culture Wars. And that has sort of broader implications for what we can do to address our problems today. I do also want to mention here our new and improved Theology Mill newsletter, which we're going to be sending out to email subscribers on a monthly basis. So if you subscribe to that newsletter, by the way, we will send you a 40% off single-use coupon code that you can use on one or any number of Whitfinstock books. So be sure to find the link to the subscription form in the show notes below if you'd like to access that offer and stay up to date with what we're doing on the show and get further deals. Make sure you check the box next to podcast updates near the bottom of that form before you hit the subscribe button. That newsletter, as I said, is going to feature regular book deals, so you'll have access to further book deals in the months ahead, and it'll give you kind of a behind-the-scenes look at what we're doing with the podcast and what's coming up on the podcast. So this April and May, for instance, of 2025, that is, we're offering a free PDF version of any single Whitfinstock book for anyone who rates the show on Spotify or YouTube and then sends us proof. So you can find all the details for that offer and further offers within those newsletters, so be sure to subscribe at the link below in the show notes. And now let's jump over to the interview. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode. So I'm here today with Dr. Laurie M. Johnson, who's the author of the new Cascade book, The Gap in God's Country, A Longer View on Our Culture Wars. So Laurie, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. So as we kind of get things going here, could you maybe share a bit with our listeners about yourself and your work?
Well, I'm the mom of a pretty cool 27-year-old and the daughter of a 97-year-old man who lives next door and pretty much operates independently still, but I do what I can to keep him anchored in the newest technology.
Sure.
So, yeah, I'm president of something called the Morin Academy, which was named after Peter Morin, who was one of the co-founders of the Catholic worker movement. And so in that capacity, I do some classes, and we do 2 podcasts through the Morin Academy. One's called Dust Bowl Diatribes, and the other is Political Philosophy, which is my podcast. And then I co-host Dust Bowl Diatribes with Spencer Hess. We host speakers too. And as a matter of fact, we've got a speaker coming up, Eugene McCarraher. You're probably familiar with him.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah. He's going to talk about his book, Enchantments of Mammon. I also work at a Catholic worker farm just when I'm in town in Kansas City. I live in Manhattan, Kansas, but I go into Kansas City once a month at least and do as much work as I can on the JP2 Catholic worker farm there. And those 2 things are kind of tied together. So if people go to our website, pmorin, MAURIN.org, they can kind of see the integration of those 2 things. And in addition to all that, I'm a full professor at Kansas State University in the political science department. I have a specialty in political thought. I've written eight other books, and they all kind of, in a way, kind of led up to the last the last one here, The Gap in
Sure.
God's
Yeah.
Country. So that's a little bit about who I am, I guess.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really like the Dust Bowl Diatribes podcast title. That's very clever. Okay, so one kind of opener question, or the opener question that I present to all of the guests that we bring on the show, is kind of this roundtable question. So if you could place any three thinkers, dead or alive, together in a room and you could listen into their conversation, which three people would you choose and why?
Okay, yeah. So you warned me about this one, and I'm glad you did because I thought quite a bit about it. And so I came up with Jesus and Socrates
Hmm,
and Karl Marx. And the reasons why, well, first of all, they all dealt with the question of God's existence and God's nature. Marx, of course, famously said he didn't exist. But, I would like to get them into a room together and hear how they would actually talk to each other. And then they all cared deeply about people's lives. They wanted to improve their lives, to help them find meaning, to like flourish, to do the right thing. And they dealt with that in very different ways. But I'd like to see just
yeah,
like if they could find compatibilities amongst themselves, because I think they could. And then they all sacrificed their lives for other people. Of course, Jesus and Socrates both, directly sacrificed their lives, but Marx, gave up any hope of a comfortable life and basically
mhm,
risked his life in the pursuit of what he considered to be right. So, he lived a very dangerous life. And so I think that they all would respect. I would hope that they would respect each other on that basis. So I would love
mhm,
to be
mhm.
like listening in on that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I love the joining of especially Marx and Jesus. That would be fun. Okay, so
What?
yeah, in this book of yours, you present kind of an overview. You kind of open the book with an overview of your own political journey over the years. So I wonder if you could, for our listeners, describe that political journey that you've been on and are on, and kind of where it has led you to today.
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief, but it's kind of hard, but I'll try.
Take your time. You can take your
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Because I mean, sort of like the summary or the point of telling the readers my personal background and the introduction to the book was that even though I have a higher education, I'm educated in politics, I know something about history and so on, I still made my political decisions for most of my life in hindsight, on the basis of mainly emotions and
Mm,
not reason or any of these things that I knew. And so I tell this story about, I grew up in a working class town, Rock Island, Illinois. It was at the time dominated by the farm implement industry, and most of the people there were working class people. My dad was a business teacher at a high school. This was during the time of integration where there were race relations issues in the mix. And, I guess we sort of were, dad identified as a working class person. He was a union type
mhm.
guy. He was in the teachers
Yeah.
union. He came from a poor background in Kentucky himself. And so, and Democrats were pretty prevalent in Rock Island, and I grew up as a Democrat and just identifying with us the stuff that I learned from my dad and my own life experience being around mainly working class and poor people.
Mhm,
So it made sense to me. And then I went to university, and well, first I went to community college, but my last 2 years I went to university and I studied journalism, and that also kind of reinforced the tendency in the liberal direction.
mm,
Um, and I got cajoled into graduate school because we were in a deep recession at the time, and
mm,
there weren't any jobs. And they were basically saying, "Hey, why don't you do a master's degree?" I got a political science master's degree to kind of like be a better journalist,
mm.
and I did it partly for that reason, but partly because they were gonna pay me to, like, get a master's degree. I didn't
Sure.
get into any debt for my higher education because we used to help people with these things.
Yeah.
But I was then exposed to intellectual conservatism. I'm sort of quote classically trained in I guess like what we would call both Anglo and continental European philosophy. The professors in the program had a fairly conservative bent, but they were also not highly political in their orientation, just like philosophically conservative. Still, though, I remained a Democrat, but I began to respect certain conservative arguments because they were reasonable, and nice people. I didn't experience much discrimination as a female in grad school, too, although I was one of like maybe two people that was female in the program.
Yeah.
But then I go out on the job market after writing a dissertation on Thucydides and Hobbes. Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian, and Hobbes was a pre-Enlightenment, but like proto-Enlightenment social contract thinker, and international relations. And I'm classically trained, and I go out on the job market, and I did go to quite a few like interviews on the East Coast. And I just got slapped in the face with the reality that in my profession, women in particular were not supposed to study those things, and that what they were
Mm-hmm.
looking for was a female who could teach feminist theory, which I have no quarrel with,
Sure.
but I have no idea, that
Yeah.
that wasn't. Yeah. So, I had really bad experiences, like, basically being ignored during the job interview, told to go home, didn't want me, like, was surprised I would
Mm.
betray, whatever. And so in the wake of that experience, and I ended up getting my first position at Radford University due to a connection that I had from my dissertation advisors. But that experience made me rethink everything. I thought, my gosh, like, is this what like, is this liberalism? I don't want to be a
Mm.
part of that. That didn't feel good. I had no idea this was a big deal. It sort of was like this crack happened, and I started really examining some of the contemporary Republican conservative type arguments. And the
Sure.
Republicans at that time, they were like reaching out. This was when they started their full court press to like get working class people and like
Mm.
former
Mm-hmm.
Democrats. And I thought, well, they're speaking to me, as a female. They're interested in issues like equality. They have a different philosophy about how to get there, but I opened my mind up to that. And I became a pretty activist, Republican conservative.
Mm-hmm.
I absorbed an awful lot of that information. And so, yeah, like I flipped basically. Now, in hindsight, I flipped because in both positions were not based on reason. On the one hand, my dad and my family background had sort of taught me to be like a liberal in our
Mm-hmm.
US language. And then I became a conservative because I was treated badly by so called liberals.
Yeah.
And so my personal experience did, you know, now as time went by, it became somewhat clear to me, but it took quite a while. I got married to a Republican. He wanted to be a leader in the local Republican Party. So it took a while. It took until after I got divorced. So,
Mm.
like, I got divorced, and that was another pivotal point in my life where everything kind of broke, all my
Mm-hmm.
human relations and everything.
Yeah.
And I could think, well, is that really like what I just do? So so it again like opened me up to rethinking, my position. And at that point, I kind of made a conscious decision that I was no longer going to be pushed around by my emotions or my
Mm.
personal life experience of being insulted by somebody or, more or less left by somebody or whatever, I was going to think more deeply about these things and probably not choose one side or the other. And I
Hmm.
reevaluated that intellectual conservatism. I started to learn more about Marxian economics. I started to learn a lot more about the environment due to some of my friends that I'm now doing the Morin Academy with.
Hmm.
And and I started to create a synthesis. So I consider myself a more independent thinker than I used to be. I'm not saying that I still don't have these reactions, but what this said to me was that I bet you an awful lot of people hold the political positions they do for personal reasons because they
Hmm.
feel insulted, left out, left behind, not consulted, disrespected. They had one bad experience or something like that that has led them to their political positions. And we need to do better than that. I needed to do better than that. And we all do.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. That's a fascinating political journey that you've been on. So thank you for sharing all that. There are kind of four theory streams that you draw from prominently in this book, and I want to make sure we get a little bit of time to talk about each of them as we chat today. So you brought up most, if not all of them already, but those four theory streams are classical conservatism, Marxist thought, Christian political theology, and then political psychology. So especially like Jungian political psychology. So
Mhm.
let's start with classical conservatism. Could you tell me a little bit about what it is you mean by that when you write about this in the book? How would you describe it? And also, what about it have you or do you find compelling?
Yeah, this is something that really needs to be talked about because most Americans, I believe, do not know what conservatism really means.
Right.
In grad school, when I got taught about conservative ideas, it was from thinkers like Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk, Michael Oakeshott, Wendell Berry, Leo Strauss, and
Mm-hmm.
so that is the way that, for instance, most Europeans would think of conservatism. Conservatism is comes from the idea of conserving, right?
Right.
Um, and it wants to conserve like tradition to the extent possible. Burke was very critical, for instance, of the French Revolution because it was like this Enlightenment revolution that was going to sweep away in a very dramatic fashion all of the traditions and customs and values of the past because they quote didn't make sense. They were
Mm-hmm.
too superstitious. The conservative says there's probably wisdom embedded in even unjust traditions. And so before we change anything, we need to untangle that and we need to be careful and we need to go slow. So conservatives of that type, they don't want rapid change. They want to go very incrementally and to be able to back up because they see human nature as inherently flawed and incapable of perfection or reaching like great heights. You can kind of amend things around the edges, but you have to have the humility to also say that doesn't work. Um, they believe in the social fabric. Everybody's tied together. We are a human family. We should like care and support each other. That should be a human right. Edmund Burke famously said that, basically caring for people, being cared for is a right. Also, they believe in preserving the environment because it's what sustains us. It's precious. We should be
Yeah.
concerned about its beauty. You know, we should want to preserve its beauty in the natural world. Russell Kirk was all about that. So conservatism is very anti-utopian, anti one size fits all, and it definitely isn't about rapid revolutionary change or like just what makes sense from the point of view of the dollar. Conservatives of this type were pretty critical of capitalism. They didn't like the pollution that it caused. They didn't like the sort of like unifocal lens on profit as
Mm-hmm.
a motivator, because people are supposed to actually care about things beyond the
Right.
almighty dollar. So that is not and never has been American conservatism. American conservatism is is closer to classical liberalism, which is which was very prominent within the French Revolution. It was a revolutionary thought at the time of the American founding that rejected the old regime, right? And it's only become identified as conservatism because it's what our country was founded on,
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but it's really quite radical. It's like, individuals have these universal natural rights. If they don't have them, they should revolt, you know,
Right.
throw it out, start over again. That's not exactly conservative.
Sure. 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 Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're kind of leaning into the next question, so it's a nice segue actually, because you make the argument as you're saying that U.S. conservatives, right, have a different makeup from kind of classical conservatism, and you even call U.S. conservatives right-leaning liberals, kind of like you've just
Mhm.
been saying. So I wonder if you might. I know you sort of already dipped into this a bit, but if you might unpack it a little bit more, what exactly do you mean by calling them like right-leaning liberals? And then how do you see kind of that the present iteration, or from what you're saying, kind of the American iteration throughout all American history of kind of conservatism in this country? How do you see that as different from the classical conservatism of someone like Burke or Kirk or some of the folks you're talking about?
Right. Well, so I guess most strikingly, the old conservative would see that social fabric as something that you have to preserve to keep society going. The new type of right leaning liberal, classical liberal, would be somebody like Margaret Thatcher, who famously said, "There is no such thing as society." She literally said
Mm,
that. There's
wow.
only individuals, and they make, you know, rational contractual agreements to be under a particular government. They have, rights to their property, to, freedom of religion and all of these things as individuals. And if they don't, if those things aren't respected, then they should push back. And either, I mean, ultimately that could mean revolution, or it could just mean rapid transformation, which is what she did, and Ronald Reagan to a certain extent tried to do as well,
Mhm.
to like return the order to something that's closer to seeing, individuals in this way with their rights, with a primacy on, property rights and, capitalism, basically. So, this is an ideology that is, I mean, it's hard to even say it's right leaning. I think we associate the right with, anti-society at this point, or anti-social progress or something like
Yeah,
that.
for sure. Yeah.
Um, but that's why I would use that term, because I want to distinguish them um, from a classical conservative, so that maybe some people may reevaluate, their own political position. Um, yeah, Reagan type conservatives are basically liberals. Another way to think about this is libertarians. That term comes
Mhm.
directly from the, liberal, which means freedom, basically. And libertarians are very, they also would argue there's really no such thing as society. We don't inherit moral responsibility for each other, you
Mm.
know. We don't necessarily respect traditions and collective moral values. So so that's basically why I wanted to like make it clear where I stand on that issue. Now, as far as like how conservatism has evolved, that's interesting, because most of my adult life I've lived in this in an era where the Republican Party was trying pretty hard to appeal to the working class, the people who had been
Mhm.
represented by Democrats. And so, and they did really well. I mean, a full court press for decades to try to do that. They didn't write anybody off. And all in the direction of this sort of Reagan Thatcher conservatism, which was appealing to them, to like working class people, for a lot of reasons, right? It was like a rising tide lifts all boats. Green,
Sure.
green is the only color. Racism doesn't matter. I mean, these were very appealing arguments. And it literally transformed, for better or worse, the political landscape in this country, where Democrats kind of became like pretty on board with most of that stuff because it was
Yeah.
popular. But of late, this is interesting because of late, the Republican Party is experiencing, I think, some schizophrenia. The
Mhm.
right-leaning liberals. Because on the one hand, they still sort of embrace that old those classical liberal positions, Reagan type conservative in a way.
Yep.
But yet the Trump quote conservative is even more radical, like extremely rapid change. We are experiencing that right now. It's revolutionary in nature. It's a barrage of change that's so quick and rapid and doesn't recognize any previous practices or within the government, as well as like the social ties and fabrics that we have with the various people that are kind of under fire
Mhm.
from these changes.
Mhm.
And also, it's unlike like Reagan conservatism was was very globalist, right? Like the more integrated our economies are around the world, the better. We will, be interdependent. Interdependence and will spread democracy. All of that. Trump has changed that, and it's much more nationalist,
Mhm.
nativist, and maybe even at least rhetorically, let's say, let's see what happens, but wanting to like retreat from a certain amount of globalization, a sort of superficial attachment to traditional values. And I think part of the reason why this is happening is because I think a lot of us have realized that some of those Reagan Thatcher innovations that we embraced for so long have not served us well. Now,
Mm. Mhm.
I'm not saying that these people have the answer, but I think that we are here because of late we've realized that this is not necessarily serving us well. And
Mhm.
but they are not the same type of conservative. So here we have like another change in the Republican Party, which is reorienting again towards isolation, at least rhetorically. It's real hard to tell right now what how
Yeah,
much
it
they actually
is.
mean. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think another, like, form of schizophrenia within the Republican Party that'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I'm anxious to see how it plays out is that you have, like, this JD Vance sort of communitarian populism thing on the
Mhm,
one hand, really appealing to working class voters. But then you also have like these tech bro kind of transhumanist capitalist people like Elon Musk as well. So I'm
mhm,
very anxious to see how that sort of plays out over time. If that tension comes to a boiling point, or if it really matters given kind of the objectives of the Republican Party. I don't know how it'll turn out, but I'm definitely interested is too casual a word, but maybe anxious is a better word to
mhm.
see kind of how that unfolds in the years ahead for sure.
Yeah, me too. It seems like a contradiction on the one hand to be anti-elitist and kind of wanting to preserve the or bolster the local and,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
ordinary person, and at the same time just really enable these mega tech billionaires to do
yeah.
whatever they want. And I think we really are experiencing chaos and lack of focus, and there's a lot of exhaustion as well, not just in the society, but also in our institutions that are just kind of decrepit. It seems like not capable of
Mhm.
really like defending themselves or operating effectively. So yeah, I think you're right. Like it's too early to say, but there's incoherence on both sides. Like the Democrats are also reeling and don't know where to stand because the Democrats became Reagan Republicans over time.
Right.
Honestly, like in their economics, right?
Yes, for
In
sure.
their
Yeah,
economics, they
yeah,
did.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
it's an interesting time to be alive.
It is. Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah. I want to move to your second theory stream. I want to make sure we get through all four. So I want to talk about kind of the Marxist streak in your book. So the second theory stream, right? Uh, how have kind of Marxian critiques of capitalism informed your own thinking? What role do they sort of figure in the synthesis you're laying out in this book?
Right. Well, they mainly inform my thinking through their critique of the capitalist economy. So, I want to make it clear I don't think that our actual experiences of communism have been at all good. And
Right.
I'm not sure that communism could ever be achieved in a good way. But Marx provided a very solid analysis of the capitalist economy that really helps us to understand some of the things that are going on right now. I go all the way back to the enclosure movement back in the 17th through the 19th century in this book, and show how in that first level of capitalism, which happened in the agricultural sector, actually not at first in the manufacturing sector, you had this period of time when all these peasants were thrown off their ancestral lands, first in England and then in a lot of the rest of Europe, thrown off their ancestral lands under the feudal system where they had been, practicing the same type of agricultural techniques, feeding their family, also, of course, propping up the aristocracy for centuries. And at a certain point, through pressures brought about by the monarchy, these aristocrats threw these peasants off those lands, and they didn't care where they went. They didn't take any responsibility. Most of them could not take any or much of their property. And they then crowded into the cities while the aristocrats went on to like rent out their lands to the highest
Mm-hmm.
bidder to do tenant farming. Okay. So now you
Mm-hmm.
have all these peasants flooding into the cities like London, who are looking for work, and vagrancy was criminalized. So you'd better work. And there was no other way to feed yourself. So I want people to realize like people went from at least being able to feed and house themselves off of without money in that system to absolutely having to have money in order to not starve. And then that created pressures that led to industrialization. Like you've got this huge labor force just ready to do this kind of work. And the dynamics took off. So,
Mm-hmm.
people being dependent on markets and money rather than their own land, their ability to work it, dependent on their neighbors. They lost that sense of connectedness to the people around them and in relying on them, and basically had to rely just on themselves. Also, it's important. I think Marxism teaches us that these developments were not moral choices primarily, but dynamics of this unfolding market that almost just happened to us. And once
Mm-hmm.
in place, created, just like almost forced people to behave in this way. We could get out of this, but it would take like concerted effort to do so.
Yeah.
I also emphasize just the wrecking ball that the capitalist system wreaks on family, community, embeddedness with any sort of culture, right? As we're all like fragmented and pushed around by the market, go where the jobs are, away from our families for most of the day, outsourcing if we're lucky enough our child care, our elder care, continually having to retool due to ever rapidly escalating automation. I mean, it's hard to like be a human being under these circumstances and have
Mm-hmm.
a family, let alone, have relationships with your neighbors or know what's going
Yeah.
on in your
Yeah.
community. So, yeah, like that's why it's important.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think one of the points you made in the book that I really appreciated was how basically the conservatives or like right-leaning liberals, whatever we want to call them, their embrace of capitalism actually erodes or even kind of destroys the very values that they're trying to protect or bring back into vogue or uh, um,
Absolutely. Yeah,
save.
like
Yeah, yeah.
Why do we have video games? Why do we have, all these, the social media? Why do we have all these things that they complain about as like fragmenting human relationships and isolating
Yeah.
people? Capitalism, right? Not
Right.
being able to say
Right.
no to like every technological innovation.
For
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. Okay, let's kind of sticking with the left here, and you've touched on this a bit already, but maybe we can dig in even a little deeper. So, what do you see as kind of the most significant transformations on the one hand, and then failures on the other hand, of the kind of the Democratic Party in the 20th and now the 21st century? And then, how would you describe kind of the transformation that in the book you call the Great Party realignment, for instance? Do you think liberals today are kind of truly leftist in an authentic sense of the word today?
Mhm. No is a short answer. I don't think
Sure.
that
Yeah.
I think a lot of them have lost touch, and this is why they couldn't make an effective pushback to the sort of onslaught that of the Republican Party of late. They have I mean, lots of people have written about this. They've lost touch with working class people and economic class concerns. Now, where I don't think I mean, I hear a lot of this and I don't like it. I don't agree with it. This tendency to say they focused only on the quote woke issues, right? Right. And that
Sure.
and that they need to stop doing that. Now I think that that kind of thing can be rather superficial. So I agree. Sometimes you use
Yeah.
those types of things rhetorically. I also, though, think that this is not an either or situation. Democrats could have remained like concerned with economic working class values and seen the connection between that and equity and inclusion and diversity and
Sure.
could have
Yeah.
done that in a way
Yeah.
that made sense. But they were not doing that. They were mainly adopting the more Republican approach to economics. I think was
Hmm.
it Nancy Pelosi that said, "I am a capitalist," right? Um, I think she did. Um, so when you aren't thinking about that or addressing those problems in any real like in a real visible way, in a real way, and you're talking about these things and maybe some of these other things in kind of a superficial way that I don't think is a good idea. But I also don't think that we need to run away from diversity and equity and inclusion
Sure.
and those
Yeah.
issues because they're wrapped up in the economics, and they are important. We should have a society where we are a democracy. We're based on the idea of universal human rights. That's and we shouldn't let go of that. And at its heart, that's what it means. So like right now, the DEI stuff is getting wielded against Democrats, but it just comes across as racist and sexist
Yeah.
actually, and that's
Yeah.
not something that you don't want to agree with that. And so I want to
Hmm.
make it clear,
Hmm.
I do emphasize economic class in my book, and I think that Democrats made a mistake when they shifted over to the cultural positions because I think that that left a lot of people out and they really needed
Yeah.
to fix these economic problems. But but I don't think it is a mistake in and of itself to concern yourself with the cultural issues too. I hope that makes
Sure.
sense.
Yeah. No, that definitely makes sense. Yeah. I want to turn to Jacques Ellul. He's a figure that you cover a bit in the book, and particularly his kind of this sort of leftist critique of technology and techno capitalism. Right. So he's really famous for his critique of what he calls technique. Right. So the technological society and so forth. So what does Ellul mean by technique? And then in what ways do you kind of see technique operating in contemporary American politics?
Okay, yeah, yeah, Ellul wrote the book, The Technological Society, so if people are interested in that, they should get it. It's long, but it's really good.
Hmm.
And as far as what he means by technique, it is not just technology of the type that we would normally think, like the computer or the manufacturing technology or whatever.
Sure.
It's also the way we organize ourselves. It's the way we think. So, like scientific management would be an example of technique as well. And what he's saying is that at a certain point after the Industrial Revolution, we adopted the position that technology is pretty much always the answer to the needs that we have or the problems that we have, and that if technology causes a problem for us, we can fix that problem with more technology. So another term for that is the technological treadmill. We've adopted this belief that technology can in fact get us out of our problems. Like an example of this in the climate change era is, well, we can, seed clouds, we can like maybe geoengineer the atmosphere somehow to block the sun,
Sure.
the sun's rays. There's always a way, and this way of thinking keeps us thoroughly embedded in that technological mindset. It narrows
Mhm.
our focus to that, right? And it makes us, in the end, slaves to technology, because another part of this way of thinking is there's really, at a certain point, we see technology as a self moving thing, something that isn't even ours to control, but something that has a life of its own and controls us,
Mhm.
and we have to adapt and respond. And if we are developing something and we see potential in it for other things, like we develop something for, let's say, one purpose of, I don't know, I'm making this up, preserving food, right? But then
Mhm.
that chemical process, oh, it can also be used as a weapon, right? Or it can also maybe be used as a medicine. We will do whatever we can with that technology. It's almost like because we have to, rather than
Mhm.
stopping and asking what uses should we put it to that will serve our interests. And of course,
Mhm.
that's tied up with the capitalist dynamics of, market imperatives that kind of like feel like they're forcing you to apply that technology any
Yeah.
possible way you can. So this is partly why, I mean, Ellul was really onto something, because this is why people are feeling like they can't control it. That's why people like working for OpenAI are saying, we need to stop and pause, and think
Yeah.
about this, like, and nobody's listening
Yeah.
to them even. It's
Yeah.
just gonna keep right on going, right? Um, everybody is just, it's like taken as an inevitability. So obviously this is very bad for our human development. Technology isn't bad in and of itself, but technique is bad because it makes us feel helpless, and then we can't think morally about our futures, and we can't make good decisions about what type of life we want to live. That
Mhm.
is really the technology developing a life of its own. I don't think AI is going to become like a murderous dictator of humanity like some people do, but
Sure.
I do think we're ceding a lot of territory of our lives to these mechanisms, and
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
don't get why we would do that, other than that we're waving the white flag here and surrendering to our own creations.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it manifests itself in really, like you're saying, kind of existential everyday ways too, that, like you said, make you feel really hopeless. Like, I know I experienced this with like smartphones, for instance. I think we all did, and how quickly that happened, that we all became not just users, but like abusers, So,
Mhm.
people who are enslaved to cell phones or even Amazon Prime, something like that. That during the course of COVID, I think we all became thoroughly addicted to, and now we almost feel like we can't function without something like Amazon Prime. I want to turn to the third of the four theory streams that you bring up. So, and Ellul is kind of a nice transition point there because he kind of fits well within the second and the third theory stream. So, here in the third stream, you have kind of Christian political theology, and you draw on a bunch of different interesting sources. So again, Ellul, but also Wendell Berry, Walter Brueggemann, Brian Zond, Catholic social teaching, the Catholic worker movement, just to name kind of a few of them. So since you work on a Catholic worker farm, and since that you bring that up quite a bit in the book, I'm wondering how this Catholic worker movement in particular has kind of impacted your understanding of the specifically Christian moral and political witness in America, and then what maybe you think the Catholic worker movement can offer to sort of our current political situation in the U.S.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Yeah, the JP2 farm, John Paul II farm in Kansas City, Missouri, is where I work, and just that whole scene there. There's another Catholic worker house of hospitality there. So that has influenced my thinking about Christianity quite a bit,
Sure.
getting involved in that. And I guess the reason why it inspires me, and I feature it a lot in my book, is I think that we get really caught up as Christians, in particular, speaking to Christians, in a dynamic where, we go to church and maybe we tithe or we write a check, and maybe we go to a study group if we're really devout or something like that. And maybe every once in a while we might even volunteer at a food pantry,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. But we don't usually just go into direct action, I guess, to like love other people or care for other people. And the Catholic worker movement is all about direct action that's unmediated by institutions. So Catholic workers aren't run by Catholic or other churches. Catholic worker operations can include non-Catholics or people who aren't even religious as well. It's kind of an anarchistic type. It's kind of weird to say anarchistic organization, but it's an
Sure.
anarchistic movement or phenomenon, and it's bucking the trend of fixing our problems with just money. Because after all, when you think about it, our tendency to just give money or like transfer, say, groceries to people, or pay a bill, or that, they are good things to do, but they aren't actually solving our social and economic problems. They're kind of just making it just a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
Direct action of just helping your neighbors, right? In a real way. Maybe taking somebody into this kind of thing that Catholic workers do. They'll take people into their home. They'll
Mm-hmm.
even take homeless people into their homes, or they'll run a house of hospitality where they'll have quite a few people on the margins that are part of that, either living there or coming there every day, helping operate it. Catholic worker farms feed themselves. They usually take people in to help grow food,
Sure.
and then, hopefully give some of that away to other people as well. So it that type of thing brings in the human element of direct contact with other people, whereas if we're just writing a check, I mean, we have no to limited contact with the people on the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
receiving line. That kind of reinforces the idea that, well, I'm the person who's the benefactor, and you
Mm-hmm.
are the recipient.
Yeah.
And in our
Yeah.
society, we have these class divisions we've already talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
That actually reinforces the class divisions. I'm not saying it's bad because people need these things, but we do have to realize it also reinforces the class divisions. The very people that you're the benefactor to, you might not want sitting in or sleeping in the pews of your church, right?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
something wrong with that. And so I like it when I see, whether it's churches or Catholic worker houses or anything like that, just cutting right past the class division and cooperating with other people. So, to me, it's an example of very serious Christianity, even though some of the people in it are not necessarily super religious, but their actions are the actions I think that a serious Christian should try to undertake.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if enough people did like help out others in a very material fashion that took their time and wasn't mainly about money, we would not have the poverty and the dislocation and the alienation that we're experiencing now. Most people aren't going to do it. It does, for those people who do it full time, it's often backbreaking, frustrating. Most
Yeah.
people do it for a while and then leave because it's that hard. And
Mm-hmm.
our society is not friendly to that level of like Christian action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to that, but I do want to make sure we make some time for this, for the kind of Jungian political psychology, because I think that's such an interesting part of your book. So this kind of represents your fourth theory stream. So how would you describe Jung's contribution to your own political thinking? And particularly, you use a couple different terms of his in the book that are pretty provocative. So I wonder if you might say what you take Jung to mean when he uses terms like ideological possession. That's one that you bring up, and then mass psychosis is another one. And then, yeah, maybe how do you kind of see those ideological possession and mass psychosis kind of being borne out in our own country?
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, Jung is a person I've been interested in for a long time. I actually wrote the previous book, Ideological Possession and the Rise of the New Right, largely when I was in my 30s, and then I
Mm-hmm.
put it aside because and, you know, I at that time there was a prejudice against political psychology in the political science field, and it just I didn't think that I could get tenure or get ahead by
Sure,
publishing this
sure.
thing. But then I found it, I relocated, and I'm like, this is really quite timely, right? So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
decided to work on
absolutely.
it more. Yeah, so like to kind of be brief, Jung thought that human beings had evolved with a religious instinct and sense, and that was based on the fact that we used to deal with and still do deal a lot with these uncontrollable forces of nature, just
Yeah.
phenomenon that were beyond our control. And so from a very early time, and Jung was like impartial as to whether religions bore any like actual truth or not. He was open to
Mhm.
it. He was curious and interested, and I think probably wanted that to be true. But he was sort of
Mhm.
agnostic in his official position, I guess you would say. But these practices, these early practices, evolved into religions, right? And religions were a way of coping with those things that otherwise could overwhelm you, and relating to the mysteries of life, right? And there's a whole theory of collective unconscious, which I won't
Yeah.
get into, but that's where these primitive experiences sort of get located in the human unconscious. And then to relate to them, religions function so that you can relate these largely unconscious forces within you to this outer world that is oftentimes very
Mhm.
frightening and mysterious. Well, anyway, so it's something deeply embedded in us, he believed. And so when, you know, the scientific revolution and the enlightenment and the industrial revolution, all these modernizing trends came along and kind of started to question whether all of that was just superstition and we didn't need that, or narrowed its scope in our lives. This did something, he believed, to the human psyche, especially when we got to the point of the Industrial Revolution and the collectivization of people in urban masses to do that kind of work. And people became more materialist in their orientation, and they lost touch with nature.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of that was within us was kind of stuffed down, and that created a sort of, I guess you might say, like a volcanic situation. Okay,
Mhm.
and so, it can't just go away in his view. It doesn't just disappear. You can't think it out of existence. If you can't express it in a legitimate way through some sort of religious practice, okay, so that you can express it, contemplate it, relate to it, it will come out in another way. And the
Hmm.
two ways that it normally comes out are psychic inflation on the one hand, which is when a person becomes grandiose. This is kind of rare, but people who think that they are like some famous person or that they're like
Yeah.
vast powerful, right? Maybe they're
Yeah.
Jesus himself. And then on the other hand, psychic or mass psychosis, which is the more
Hmm.
common thing where people gravitate towards usually a particular figure like an Adolf Hitler or a Mao,
Hmm.
somebody like that, and they form this mass movement in which that figure leads the way. But it's very, when you think about it, like the dynamics of those kind of movements are very religious, highly symbolic, highly
Yeah.
collective, very worshipful. People kind of turn their rational brain off at a certain point and adore the leader and
Hmm.
obey the rules of the movement and all of that. So Jung said what that is that secular religion,
Hmm.
and it's bad because in a real religious faith, God is up here. You can't control God or the gods. You have to have a sense of humility. That human beings can only do so much. But in a
Yeah.
secular religion or mass psychosis, whatever you want to call it, he called it ideological possession, right?
Hmm.
You are somehow able to believe that this human God and this human movement of religious faith will achieve like paradise on earth and immanentize the eschaton, bring
Hmm.
what is like holy and beautiful and good down to earth so that we can live these perfect lives.
Yeah.
So it's a huge spiritual mistake, and as a Christian I think it's a sin. It is a serious heresy, and a problem for a Christian to adopt a secular faith, to be
Hmm.
so like faithful in their politics that they forget the actual religion. So I do talk to that, but in a nutshell, that's kind of what ideological possession is. I know it sounds like scary, and it is scary, right? Like
Hmm. Hmm.
it's it evokes, the idea of, like, demonic possession, and I think Carl Jung kind of intended to invoke that
Yeah.
idea.
Sure. Yeah. Do you see this ideological possession particularly operative in any unique ways today, especially in America?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, obviously there's the big elephant in the room, the sort of, the MAGA movement, but
Yeah.
before I get to that, like, we're susceptible to this already because I think Americans long have ceded way too much of their agency to the government, and the
Yeah.
idea that the government can just do anything, and that the
Right.
president in particular is like the monarch of the government, and he can just wave a
Yes.
magic wand and make the economy change. And
Right.
so it already, we were set up for this. And then the MAGA movement, I mean, Donald Trump's don't come along very often. So it does take a sort of mesmerizing figure that you can't really quite figure out like why they are so mesmerizing, but Jung
Hmm.
called them mana personalities. They have this ability to absorb the energy and the desires and the dreams and the feelings and the anger of a mass of people
Hmm.
and direct it, like, and and, I don't know exactly how that works, but you can see it, because on the
Yeah.
surface, Donald Trump is not a very special person. I mean, he seems to be not all that intelligent. I could be wrong. Maybe he's hiding it, but he doesn't seem like he's like, brilliant. He has like traits that normally would be kind of putting. You might not want Donald Trump to be your next door neighbor. He's kind
Yeah.
of, kind of yuck. But
Sure.
on the other hand, like an awful lot of people just everything that he says and comes out of his mouth is gold. And that's turning off your critical faculties, because nobody's perfect and nobody is right about everything. And, if you walk down the street and shoot somebody, you should get arrested, and this kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So obviously people have turned off their critical thinking and ceded it to this figure who happens to be Donald Trump. Could be somebody else, but I will say this type of figure doesn't come along every day. So if there is nobody that has this, whatever it is, je ne sais quoi, right? This thing, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
then maybe the spell is broken. But we are living through a time where we have a man of personality who is absorbing that energy, and the energy is there because there's a heck of a lot of dissatisfaction
Mm-hmm.
out
Mm-hmm.
there. It has no place to place it, and it doesn't have, I know people will argue about this, but like, I don't think we have enough genuine religious faith to
Yeah.
be able to like handle all that.
Yeah.
So it's moving to him and the MAGA movement.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Well, I think kind of ending on a practical note and coming back a bit to some of the things you were saying about the Catholic worker movement and direct action, I think that might be a good note to kind of end on. So, what's maybe one piece of advice that you would give to Christians in America today who are trying to be faithful and active political agents without getting sucked into some of the divisive ideologies that are on offer?
Hmm. I would say do some direct action, meaning, for instance, if your community has a warming center or a homeless shelter, go there, spend some hours, do a shift, do
Yeah.
it regularly, talk to these people, start to like interact with these people that you're serving, see their humanity, realize what their potential could be, see that your country isn't perfect and that not everything is working well.
Mhm.
You won't be able to see them as just social problems if you spend enough time with them. So do something like that. Reach out to the people around you. Do some sort of cooperative work with them, if it's your neighbors or even your own family members, but on a fairly serious level. And you can cut right past the institution of church if necessary, as well as the politics, to have that direct experience. Catholic Christians and some other Christians believe that Jesus is in other people, that one way to meet Jesus is to meet your neighbor, especially the poor, the orphan, the widow, the person who is on the outs of society. You can meet Jesus at a homeless shelter, and and you probably should. And you
Mhm.
won't be able, if you do it enough and you're there long enough, you won't be able to care as much about some of these political arguments that we're having. And if your church is highly politicized, you'll probably see that at that point, because
Mm.
I think a lot of our churches are highly politicized, and they see what, even on the left, even the left-leaning
Yeah.
churches, they see lobbying, donations, volunteering for political, that those are the main, ways to make change for poor people, people who are on the outs of society. And yes, we do need changes in our laws, but we also need to change ourselves. We are the reason why this has happened. And the only
Mhm.
way we can, and I mean Christians in particular, honestly, like, I think
Yeah.
without Christians in America, we wouldn't be in the turmoil that we're in now. So, we can be, I think, part of the solution if we meet Jesus amongst our neighbors and our
Mhm.
friends, and particularly the people who are the least well off in our society. And then we need to obey what he says, even if it's, even if you don't like it. Read the New Testament. That would be my advice. Read the New Testament. Maybe don't go to church as much for a
Mm.
while.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't think that we always have to have church at a building in a church.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you, Laurie, so much for this rich and wide-ranging conversation. As we end things, I want to give you a chance to just share about anything you'd like to plug here, any kind of works you have in progress. So, is there anything on that front that you'd like to share here? And then maybe if there's somewhere listeners who are interested in you and your work, where can they find you?
Okay. Well, to begin with, so this year I'm pretty much devoting to promoting this book, and one of the ways I'm doing that is through YouTube videos, and those are associated with the Morin Academy. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess if you want to learn more about the book, I would go to that pmaurin.org. That's PMAURIN.org. And you can go from there. We also have just a lot of classes. And like I said, the podcast. I also have a personal website, lauriemjohnson.com, that you can go to. So, and we have a Patreon for those who know what a Patreon. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
you pay a subscription. Ours is pretty low because we're all about like trying to educate people, and we want people that don't have a lot of money to be able to join us and get that education in the intersection of religion, politics and economics, and the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have these heterodox conversations and classes where we don't adhere to a particular ideological view, and we try to have dialogues and kind of get to the heart of those issues. So I would encourage people to check that out. Of course, get my book. and but what I'm thinking about in the future is there's two options that I'm considering. One would be to try to pitch a companion to Peter Morin's Easy Essays, where I explain the intellectual inspirations, the people that he refers to in the Easy Essays that he learned a lot from, so that people, when they read his Easy Essays, which are quite short and
Yeah.
oftentimes read like poetry in a way,
Yeah.
they'd
Yeah.
be able to say, "Oh, that's what he means by the Green Revolution," or whatever it is, you
Yeah.
know?
Okay.
So that's one thing I'm thinking about doing. And then also, I inherited a manuscript from Glenn Swager, who is a person who endowed a program I direct at K State, and he was a psychologist at the
Mm.
Manager Clinic before he became the CEO of a banking chain. And he and I had a lot of conversations about political psychology. His manuscript is called Apocalyptic Hatred. At least that was kind of like the
Mm.
work
Wow.
manuscript. And in its own way,
Yeah.
it's about ideological possession.
Yeah.
And his wish was for me to like straighten that manuscript up, add what I needed to add, and kind of like co-author with him.
Mm.
And he has passed, so I inherited this, and I definitely want to do that before I retire. So
Sure.
I got to decide which of those two I want to tackle first, but I want to get to both of them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they both sound delightful. I'll be excited to see both of them. Laurie, thank you so much for joining us. For listeners, the book is called The Gap in God's Country, A Longer View on Culture Wars. Thank you for taking the time today, Laurie. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was great.